Today we're going to talk about Actually, we're going to look at the financial crises that destabilized the old regime throughout the course of the 18th century and paved the way to revolution. For this lesson, you're going to need something to take notes with, and you're going to need one primary source, the Parliamentary Remonstrance against the Reforms of Royal Debt, which is available on Canvas. This video is going to be organized into three parts. In the first part, we're going to survey the financial structures of the old regime. In the second part, we'll take a chronological look at what happened over the course of the 18th century and how French kings managed to create a fiscal crisis for the crown. And then finally, we'll conclude with a look at how the fiscal crisis opened the door to revolution. All right, let's get going. We have to start by understanding how governments fund themselves. Remember that old regime France was a monarchy, meaning that the ruling party was essentially a dynastic family, so the finances of the royal family were the same thing as the finances of the state. So, how did the old regime government fund itself? Well, the king got money from three sources. First, he got money from the lands and property that he himself owned. The king was the largest landowner in France, and all the money he reaped from those assets was added directly to the government's coffers. Second, the king got money through taxes. We're going to detail what these taxes were and how they operated in just a bit. Third, the king could raise quick funds through loans. If the king wanted money, it had to come through one of these three sources. Let's dive a little deeper, though, and look more closely at how all of this worked. We don't really need to detail how state assets worked. I mean, it's as simple as the king had stuff, that stuff made money, and the king got to spend that money how he wanted. Boom. But taxes are a little more complicated. There were three types of taxes, and each of them had certain pros and cons for the general financial and political situation of France. The first and most important tax was the taille. This was the only real permanent tax in France. In brief, the taille was a tax based on an estimation of the value of the land. Royal administrators estimated how much the products of each parish in France would be worth, and then set an appropriate tax rate on that amount. And then local officials had to figure out how to hit that mark by collecting money from the local population. The important thing to note here is that two groups were exempt from paying the taille: the nobility and the clergy. By right, they never contributed to the collection of the taille. It was entirely supplied by members of the Third Estate, and mostly the rural population. The taille was often very burdensome, as the picture shown here depicts. The first two estates stand on top of a boulder, labeled taille, that is crushing a member of the Third Estate. This is generally how people perceived of the taille in the Third Estate. Second, there were indirect taxes on goods and services. These taxes ran the gamut, but the most important were the gabelle, which was a tax on salt, and aide, which were taxes on particular services, a la the sort of famous stamp tax in the British North American colonies. And finally, the douane and traite, which were customs or tolls for traveling on royal roads or entering through the gates of certain cities. Because of the privilege of certain provinces, however, the rates of these taxes could vary widely. The map you see here illustrates the price of salt in various regions throughout France in 1789. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the top left and the border between the province of Brittany and the Maine, in Brittany, the price of a sack of salt was about 2 to 3 livres. But right across the border in the Maine, the price of salt was 58 livres. This was because Brittany had the privilege of having no gabelle, or no royal salt tax. So you can see the differences illustrated here. Finally, there were occasional taxes enacted by the monarchy for special reasons. In times of war, the crown would sometimes level new direct taxes on the populace. The first such tax was the capitation, or the tax on every head, created by Louis XIV in 1695. We'll talk more about this in a bit. Royal administrators essentially broke down all of France into 22 different tax brackets and divided the people into those brackets and placed a certain amount for each member of each bracket. As it was supposed to be a tax on every head, even the nobility were included in this tax, though still not the clergy. In fact, the king himself, somewhat ironically, appeared on the list of the capitation at the very top, though what difference it made to pay a tax to oneself is completely debatable. Later in the 18th century, there were other occasional taxes levied by French kings. From 1710 to 1748, the monarchy collected the dixième, a 10% tax on the assets of members of the second and third estates. And in 1748, the monarchy added the vingtième, a 5% tax on assets. There were two main problems with this system of taxation. The first was privilege. Some groups in the old regime had the privilege of not having to pay a lot of these taxes. The clergy, for example, didn't pay taxes at all, and the nobility was exempt from paying the taille. This meant that the system of taxation in France was fundamentally unequal, and it often taxed the people with the least amount of money in the country rather than the most. The second problem was implementation. The occasional taxes, like the dixième and the vingtième, depended on self-reporting of one's total assets, and this system was rife with abuse. Plus, the monarchy depended upon the Parliament to enforce all of these tax laws, and that meant that the monarchy depended upon the cooperation of bodies like the Parliaments and other nobility to actually collect the taxes that they decreed should be collected. Let's take a closer look at how loans worked. There were two main forms of loans. The first were called rentes, and they were essentially government-issued bonds. Think of like savings bonds that your grandparents used to buy for you when you were a kid. The second was a bit more complicated. The monarchy sold venal offices in the royal administration to the highest bidder, and the sale of offices effectively acted as a loan. People would pay a certain amount up front and then would recollect that amount plus some in wages, or what were called gages, for their position over the course of time. Royal offices came with certain unassailable benefits. First was the money, of course, but even more importantly, most royal offices came with ennoblement. So wealthy members of the third estate could purchase a venal office and not only receive a paycheck, but also gain noble status and all the privileges that came with it. For even more money, the monarchy eventually allowed venal office holders to purchase a paulette, which was a right to bequeath their office to their sons. This fixed the income in the family and essentially guaranteed that the loan would pay off. As you might suspect, there were problems with this system of revenue collection as well. And to explore this a little further, we're going to turn to Card Shark Watkins. Card Shark?
Right, listen, loans were a bad bet for the monarchy. First, they totally depended on credit. People only purchased rentes and venal offices when they believed that the monarchy would hold up its end of the bargain. Remember, France was still an absolute monarchy, so the king could effectively decide not to pay back the loans, and there wasn't nothing people could do about it. But when the king defaulted, their credit took a nosedive, and the next time they wanted loans, no one wanted to go along with it. It's kind of like getting called on a bad bluff. Once you show, nobody's going to believe you after that. Second, some of the loans, they went toxic real quick, especially after the invention of the paulette. The monarchy got some quick cash, but then it took a never-ending schedule of payments afterwards. It's kind of like chasing an inside straight from the flop. You just keep paying and paying and paying and paying.
Thanks, Card Shark. All right, now let's take a look at what French kings did with this financial situation and how their decisions ended up hurting the French monarchy over the course of the 18th century. It all began with Louis XIV. Louis XIV spent almost his entire reign fighting wars with his European neighbors, and he was largely very successful. France extended its territory significantly in the east as a result of Louis XIV's campaigns. Louis's success, however, came from a massive investment in the army. In his wars against the Spanish in the 1660s, he marshaled an army of over 150,000 men. By the 1670s, he had expanded that army to over 200,000. In 1691, the army included more than 395,000 soldiers. In fact, there were more soldiers than priests in Louis XIV's France. To pay for this massively expanding army, Louis XIV did two things. First, he created new taxes. Louis XIV was responsible for the first occasional tax, the capitation, which he enacted in 1695, as well as the dixième, which was the first true income tax, enacted in 1710. All of these taxes were approved by the Parlement of Paris, largely because France was at war. But second, Louis XIV sold a massive amount of venal offices to collect quick cash. By the end of his reign, there were over 50,000 paid officers in the royal administration in just the justice and finance sectors alone. Now, the problem with this approach was twofold. First, the increased taxes angered a lot of people, most especially the nobility, who were required to pay these taxes, particularly the capitation and the dixième, for the first time, an unheard of innovation for the time. And second, as Card Shark Watkins explained, the wave of venality meant that the monarchy got short-term gain, but long-term pain. Despite the monarchy's efforts, by the end of Louis XIV's reign, the royal debt was at 2 billion livres. To put this into context, the average farmer in France made an annual income of around 80 livres. Louis XIV created an enormous financial problem for France. Louis XIV's successor made things even worse. Having inherited a massive debt, Louis XV attempted to pay it off through new taxes. When the dixième expired in 1748, Louis XV replaced it with the first vingtième. And once again, the Parliament of Paris approved the new tax, in part because it was an effective reduction in the amount from the dixième, and because they understood the need to pay down the royal debt. But unfortunately, Louis XV fell into the same situation as his predecessor. In 1756, France entered into the 7 Years' War, which became a financial disaster for the crown. The war itself cost the king around 1.325 billion livres. Fearing financial collapse, in the latter years of the war, Louis tripled the vingtième tax, taking the tax from 5% of assets to 15%, and justified it by saying that it was the only way that France could win the war. Making matters worse, France lost the war and had to agree to give up large portions of their overseas empire, including their North American colonies, with the exception of the Caribbean islands, which meant a huge reduction in income from the colonies. Well, after the war, Louis XV tried to offset this imbalance by forcing the parlements to renew the triple vingtième tax during peacetime. This was an act that the parlements objected to strenuously, as you will read about in a moment. When the renewed vingtième was set to expire, Louis XV once again went to the parlements to renew the tax, and this time the parlements refused. So the king set his new financial minister, Joseph-Marie Théret, to come up with a new plan. Théret's plan was dramatic. To deal with the debt, he proposed, first, a new plan for increased taxes. Second, a partial default on government loans. Third, a readjustment of the terms of loans from long-term to sort of short-term payoffs. Fourth, a package of new loans that the monarchy would force the parliaments to pay. And fifth, a suspension on loan payments from the government for a certain amount of time. Well, this was completely unacceptable to the parliaments, who went on strike rather than be forced to pass such a draconian financial plan. The king responded, however, with what became known as the Maupeou coup, named after the French chancellor at the time, Chancellor Maupeou, who officially disbanded the parliaments and jailed many of the magistrates. Maupeou constructed new courts that would replace the parlements and packed them with royal allies, and then forced those new courts to approve Théret's financial plan. In the end, the triple vingtième was extended to 1781. The crown repudiated millions of livres of royal debt and reduced the payment on all rents, by 10 to 15%. Louis XV's decision made things much, much worse. And now I think it's a good time to pause this video and to read the primary source that you have with you, the Parliamentary Remonstrance against the Reform of Royal Debts. This is going to make sense of how the Parliament objected to Louis XV's proposals and why it became such a problem. This is a fascinating document, and we're going to discuss it more in class. But in the meantime, I just wanted to show you how Louis XV responded to the Parlement's remonstrance. In reaction to the Parlement's protest against the prospect of renewing the triple vingtième and taking out new loans, the king simply said the following: "I know the needs of my people, and am aware of all the efforts that they have made during the duration of the war. When I decided on the edicts and on the statement that I had entered into the register, I had already thought about the points that the Parlement brings to my attention in their remonstrances. I was constrained by necessity to provide for the expenses of the state and for its freedom. I cannot change anything in the plan that I have proposed. My Parlement shall become aware of its usefulness when it is executed, and shall recognize my views that are aimed at relieving my people." Louis XV was clearly unconcerned with what the magistrates thought and unwilling to change his mind about the renewed taxes and loans. Well, all of this came to a head during the reign of Louis XVI. The first problem was that Louis XV and Terray had effectively destroyed royal credit. The Maupeou coup meant that no one trusted the monarchy. Second, the new court set up by Maupeou simply didn't have the political capital to enforce the new taxes issued by the monarchy, so revenues didn't really increase in any dramatic way. In a desperate attempt to save the monarchy from bankruptcy, Terray, in one of his final acts, created new rentes with terrible terms in order to attract investors. The rentes were lifetime annuities, meaning they paid for the entire life of the bondholder, and the annual rate of payment was upwards of 12% of the principal. This meant that after just over 8 years, an investor could make profit off of the investment. Foreign investors took advantage. In one famous scheme called the 30 Genevan Maids scheme, Genevan bankers compiled together groups of 30 Genevan girls who had already survived smallpox, the main kind of killer in early modern Europe at the time, and had them buy these lifetime rentes as a group. It meant that the annuity would pay off for the entire lives of these 30 girls, which was probably in the order of 30 to 40 to 50 years after that. The monarchy continued to swing deeper and deeper into debt. Well, upon ascending to the throne, Louis XVI sought to change things and restore royal credit. The first thing he did was fire Terray and Maupeou and restore the original parlements, freeing imprisoned magistrates and divesting them once again with authority in 1774. Second, he appointed a new financial minister, Jacques Necker, who was a Genevan banker and an ardent reformer. Necker sought to restore royal credit through a series of important reforms. First, he used royal assets to buy back venal offices. Second, he reformed the tax mechanism so that collection would be much more reliable. And third, and probably most importantly, he attempted to stoke public confidence in the crown by publishing the accounts of the king for the first time in French history. We'll read the preface to this book in class, but it went a long way to restoring confidence in the French financial system and the monarchy itself. Necker became a champion of the people, and his policies saved the monarchy a reported 84.5 million livres each year in expenditures. The problem, however, is that Louis XVI did what both of his predecessors had done before him. Louis XVI got France involved in a war, specifically the War of American Independence. In April 1777, he began shipping weapons and supplies to the American rebels. In February 1778, he signed a formal treaty with them. And though the war was successful for the Americans and the French, it still cost the crown another 1 billion livres to fight. Necker's savings went immediately down the toilet as new debts were incurred from the war. All three French kings of the 18th century made mistakes that put the monarchy into serious financial troubles. And by the 1780s, the situation was once again in dire circumstances, and there were no new suggestions on how to fix it. Matters went from bad to worse in the 1780s. In 1781, because of pressure from members of the court, Louis XVI fired Jacques Necker. Necker's dismissal sent loan rates skyrocketing beyond 10% overnight. The king hired a series of financial ministers, all of whom had trouble taking control of the financial situation. By 1788, the royal debt was ballooning past 1.3 billion livres, 792 million of which was wrapped up in toxic, long-term annuities with rates of over 10%. 50% of the government's revenues were going to just servicing the interest on the debt. And in 1786, the crown's revenues amounted to 474 million livres, and its expenditures were 575 million livres, meaning that the crown had a deficit of over 100 million livres. Something drastic needed to happen. Well, the drastic plan came from a new financial minister, Charles Alexandre Calonne, in 1787. Calonne called for a complete reconstruction of the system of taxes in France. He recommended a heavy increase in indirect taxes, especially taxes on colonial goods and services, a part of the economy that was largely untouched by the bulk of old regime taxes before this. Second, he proposed the abolition of the taille and the introduction of a new land tax that would apply to everyone in France, including even the clergy. This new system, he suggested, would put France back in a sound financial situation. Such a radical plan, however, needed buy-in from the powers that be. Calonne originally considered going to the parlements, but they had been burned so much by previous reform efforts from the monarchy that they were considered unreliable allies. Instead, Calonne called an assembly of notables, a hand-picked group of nobles and clergymen, to accept and promote his new plan. But surprisingly, however, when the Assembly of Notables met in 1787, they completely rejected it. They demanded to see the king's accounts, like Necker had shown them years prior, and criticized Calonne and the monarchy for taking what was a sound financial situation under Necker, according to Necker, and ruining it in the course of 6 years. Having failed at his plan, Calonne was subsequently fired and replaced with yet another financial minister, Loménie de Brienne. Well, Brienne had his back up against the wall. To mix my metaphors, Brienne had to throw a Hail Mary. There simply was no plan to get money to offset the growing debt of the crown. So in November 1787, he approached the Parlement of Paris once again and requested a loan to help tie things over. The Parlement initially refused, but then agreed on one massive condition: that Louis XVI agreed to call the Estates General into session to deliberate over the financial situation of France. Now, the Estates General was a historical representative body where delegates from each of the 3 estates came together to deliberate on important matters of the state. But the important thing to note is that the Estates General had not met in France since 1614. The Parliament's request was simply extraordinary. But Brienne, left with no recourse and seeing no way of keeping the monarchy from bankruptcy, reluctantly agreed. The calling of the Estates General opened the door to the revolution. As you'll see in a few weeks, it was at the Estates General in 1789 that members of the Third Estate demanded equal representation and eventually broke away to form the National Assembly. These were the first kind of acts and events of the official revolution in France. So the fiscal crisis is significant because without the fiscal crisis, we would not have had an Estates General. And without the Estates General, we wouldn't have had a revolution. Okay, that's it for this video. Don't forget to bring your notes to class. Good job, good luck, and see you soon.